It's absolutely wonderful to see so many faces here tonight, both from obviously the current SDP, from the OII MSc and DPhil programme, past SDPs, and obviously also friends like Judy of the OII, going back a long time. So it's a really, really lovely opportunity, just first of all to say happy birthday to SDP, obviously 10 years this year, which we are absolutely thrilled about. I think Bill and I have always agreed that the Summer Doctoral Programme is pretty much one of the best things that we do. It's certainly the most intense 2-week period in the OII year. More academic conversations held during that 2-week period, I think, than at any other point during our academic calendar. Over the last 10 years, we've now had nearly 300 internet researchers coming through our doors for this programme. And many of those, such as some of the ones that are here tonight, are now in really quite senior positions in universities around the world. People like Urs Gasser and Colin McClay at the Berkman Centre can't be with us today, unfortunately. Marcus Foth with us today, founder and director of your centre at the QUT. Jean Burgess, deputy director of her centre there. So again, it's just so obvious that not only do we take in great students, but great academics come out at the other end of their DPhils. So it's perhaps a little bit excessive to call this a conference. I mean, quite frankly, it was a very good excuse to have a little jolly and bring some past students back and get to hear about what you're all doing. But we did want to use this to help us reflect on how far we've come over the last 10 years. And so over the next sort of 24 hours or so, we're going to have an opportunity to reflect both on the very sort of fast pace of change in the technology itself, but also in our research, and perhaps also to look at some of the themes that have endured over those 10 years. I also hope, and this is perhaps a sort of personal plea, that we'll get some insight into some of the research challenges that we might face over the next 10 years. And I think that will give some of us at OII, fruit for thought in our own research. So we're going to kick off this evening, if you like, with the view from the top, from the established faculty. And then we're going to hear tomorrow the alternative view from the students currently doing their DPhils from this year's programme. And we're going to see how the two approaches compare. So tonight, though, I'm really delighted to introduce our three speakers who are going to have sort of 10 to 15 minutes just to reflect on how the research has changed in their fields over the last 10 years and what their view of the challenges ahead are. So first up, we're going to have Judy Wajcman, Head of Sociology at the LSE, previously Professor of Sociology at ANU in Australia, Research Associate, and I have to say, just very, very good friend of the OII. We were just bemoaning the fact that actually on this occasion we're getting you back and there isn't a fridge of Prosecco in our library, which there was the last time Judy came to see us. We're going to have, the second speaker tonight is Bill Dutton, obviously a very familiar face probably to a lot of you, the founding director of the OII, Professor of Internet Studies, and author obviously of a lot of the books that we set on our reading list as set texts. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to have, if you like, an SDP success story. So Marcus Foth, who was from the second year, wasn't it, of the Summer Doctoral Programme? As I just said, founder and director of your own centre, the Centre for Urban Informatics Research at Queensland University of Technology. So hopefully three quite different perspectives. There'll be lots of time for Q&A at the end. We are going to try and record this just so we can get something up on the website, just as we'd like to record the student session tomorrow as well. So if you can, try and keep your questions until after people have spoken altogether, that would be great. Judy, do you want to come up?
Great. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really sorry I haven't been able to come for a few days. I'm actually writing a book on time and I haven't had the time to be here. And it's I was thinking on the train, it's completely classic, but I love coming up here because I do actually have the most stimulating and interesting conversations and thoughts when I'm here. So I do feel like a groupie, an OII groupie, and I'm delighted to be here. Vicki sort of always casually just says, why don't you just pop up and reflect for a few moments on the last 10 years of internet research. And I said, I'm not quite up to doing that, but I thought the best thing I could do was just to throw out a couple of ideas, a couple of issues that I've been kind of thinking about and hope that it will help provoke some discussion from you. And the first issue I want to raise really is to talk about the supposed newness of the internet. I want to raise that as my first of just two issues. Now, whatever theoretical perspective we've got, and I'm sure you've been talking about this for the last few days, that we all agree that the internet isn't just a technology. We all now think about the internet as interlinking webs and networks of people, artifacts, institutions, and cultural meanings, that we all think technological change is contingent, that there's a lot of unexpected things that happen. that technology and society are kind of mutually shaped or constituted, and we all think that we're way past any theories of technological determinism. I think that's probably a summary of the kind of basic things we all agree on. Now, in the circles I mix in very many circles, actually, more than you'd like to know, but in some of the circles I mix in, there's a lot of talk about new materialities, a lot in STS and in sociology and in cultural studies. There's lots of conferences I notice on new materialities, and a lot of people are deploying the concept of performativity to try and kind of capture the notion that the boundaries between humans and machines aren't fixed in advance, but are kind of enacted and processual. And I'm sure you'll have had discussions about active network theory and other theories over these days, and I'm very happy to engage with you about any of those things. But the reading I've been doing recently on the internet, what's really sort of struck me, I must say, is that there's still what I refer to as a radical discourse of discontinuity. And I'm sorry if I too often use Manuel Castells as my foil, but I really think he asks for it when he talks about timeless time. But I should say that I could equally be talking about the British sociologist John Urry's idea about instantaneous time, Paul Virilio's idea about chronoscopic time, or Robert Hassan's idea of network time. It seems to me all of them discuss the revolutionary implications of the internet by dividing cutting-edge technologies from existing technologies, and I would argue that by doing that, they're actually falling into a kind of technological determinism, even though they're always denying that they're doing that. Now, I think it's very evident when Castells talks about the effects of the internet in terms of time-space compression, and I'm sure you're all incredibly familiar with his work about the network society and the information age, and that we're now in a period of instant flows and horizontal communication networks, and that virtuality has become a very important aspect of our lives. And for Castells, he says the information age, organised around the space of flows and timeless time, marks a whole new epoch in human existence, human experience. Now, my point is not to deny that the internet has major effects, and I'm sure that's what we're going to be kind of talking about for the bulk of our discussion today. But I really am struck by the lack of attention to continuities, to understanding technological change as an ongoing process. And I've recently myself been rereading. Actually, I find myself rereading a lot nowadays, things I've read before, and I see very different things in them. It's interesting, actually. But I've been rereading historians like Carolyn Marvin's book, When Old Technologies Were New, David Edgerton, who I only recently met, actually, with Steve Shapin, he's written a book called The Shock of the Old. There's a wonderful essay by James Carey on the telegraph. And all of these historical works really are arguing that the difference between the telegraph and the internet has been exaggerated. That if you look back at the technological changes that occurred at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, that the technological changes were really as radical as they are today. And I love going back to the classical depiction of railway journeys in Dickens and Proust and writers of that period, where they really do talk about the annihilation of space and time. And if you'll allow me just very quickly, one quote from Lord Salisbury, who was Prime Minister in 1899, just very quickly, talking about the electric telegraph. He said, "The electric telegraph has, as it were, assembled all mankind upon one great plain, where they can see everything that is done and hear everything that is said and judge of every policy that is pursued at the very moment those events take place." And he goes on to talk actually about, he doesn't use the word globalisation, but actually it's a discussion about how the telegraph really has brought us to global time. So as I say, I do think the degree of time-space compression involved in the internet is very sort of marked, but I think the notion of kind of a global world brought on by these technologies isn't as new as we may think. And I think that a lot of our discussions about the internet kind of presuppose a particular past. And I think it's worth going back and looking at that past to really see what's radically changed. Point one, and I've just got another one. Actually, I thought three. I had three, but I thought three was too many. So I'm just doing two, departing from the Althusserian triad that some of us will remember. So moving on to the second point. I really think that, which is related to the point about history, that I think once you start thinking historically, you start thinking about how the internet really reflects our society, that it's an expression and reflection of our society, and that we carry out a lot of research on how culture has influenced the construction of the internet, but perhaps we don't reflect quite enough about how the internet is kind of shaping our social and political culture. I picked up, and I've got it here, the latest issue of ICS coming here to prepare myself, and the opening essay by Leah Lavro, where she's reflecting on 10 years of internet research. She writes about how popular perceptions and discourses about online communication and new media have shifted, she says, from a long-standing emphasis on possibility, novelty, adaptability and openness toward current preoccupations with risk, conflict, vulnerability, routinization, stability and control. And I think you can see exactly this shift in the trajectory of the work of Sherry Turkle over the last 30 years. So I want to spend my last few minutes talking a little bit about her work, because I've just come back from New York about a month ago, and a piece she wrote in the New York Times was all a kind of a rage in New York with everyone I went to see. So let me just say a few words about her in this sort of making my second point. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with her wonderful early books like Life on the Screen, where she really enthused about the possibilities of the internet. And she talked about the potential for people to express multiple and often multiple selves, multiple identities, to explore aspects of the self, play with their identity in really new ways, and that millions of people were living out these very creative possibilities on the internet. And actually, I went back to look at my techno-feminism book, and I think it was even the older book, and where I have a sort of quite a long discussion about her saying this. And I mean, my favourite line of hers is her statement that the internet is the material expression of the philosophy of postmodernism. I think that was absolutely her best. But you get a flavour of when she's writing and how she's kind of thinking about the internet. And then she brings out this new book recently called Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And it's got a radically different tone than all of this earlier kind of genre, all of these sets of books. It's not anymore about what the internet can do for us, but rather what the internet is doing to us, how it changes who we are. And her early optimism is now replaced with all these images of being tethered by ubiquitous media technologies. Now that we're wearing the web with us all the time in mobiles, she says, we're too busy communicating to think. We're too busy communicating to communicate with who is important, and we would rather text than talk. She's scathing about Facebook and texting, and even though she rejects the metaphor of kind of addiction, really that is what she's talking about, I think. And she's very concerned about maintaining a sphere of intimacy and privacy away from technologies. And I saw her in Boston, had a long meal with her, lasted for hours and hours and hours, this intense discussion. And one of the things she sort of told me during this was that she's been interviewing people at funerals who are literally sort of texting while they're kind of attending funerals, which she found shocking. I can see people here don't find it. I find it shocking. Anyway, she advocates internet-free zones, such as the kitchen, dining room and the car. And incidentally, around the same time as people were talking about her piece, there was another piece in the New York Times which was about black hole resorts, which I hadn't read about, but which is basically about people paying a fortune to go on very chic holidays where there's no connection, when you're out of any sort of connection. Now, I find it very interesting that once more there's such a polarised debate about the effects of this move to individualise, privatise media communication. You know, that on the one hand, you have people who are incredibly optimistic about the freedom and the increased individual autonomy. And I remember actually Manuel Castells a year ago at the big conference here literally talking about the internet as a kind of freedom tool, you know. And then on the other side, you have someone like Turkle, who really thinks that we're living in a world of constant connectivity, but the communication is less meaningful. And I think it's interesting because I've been around a long time and I'm very aware of these, you know, that 20 years ago, I think, we got bored with writing, you know, the optimism and the pessimism. You know, every article was like that. And somehow we still seem stuck in these polarisations. Now, some of you know I've done a lot of research on mobile phones and the internet myself. The picture I've got from interviews is that people are very positive about the effect of the mobile phone on their relationships, that they talk to me about the importance of the phone for work-life balance, and they even talk about these technologies as new tools for intimacy. So the very opposite of what Turkle is talking about. So I suppose I'd just like to end. I want to keep in my time and I can come back later. But I just wanted to end, I guess, for a bit of a plea for more reflexivity, really, on the kind of questions we ask when we do internet research. You know, how much actually we're taking the values of the time, you know, that we're now in a risk society, so we think about the internet in terms of risk, you know, that how much kind of, you know, that we should think a little bit more about the kind of questions we ask and the kind of directions of research we're going in, just to be a little bit more self-conscious about that. And it seems to me a bit of, you know, a bit of history is a good antidote for doing that. Thank you.
I want to congratulate Vicki on the 10 years of the SDP. That's absolutely incredible. Anyway. It's one of the first things we decided to do at the OII, and it truly is one of the most successful things we've done, and it's largely because Vicki did it. So anyway, congratulations on that. I saw Sherry. I met Sherry Turkle the first time in late 70s, and she was talking about how using computers changes the way people think about themselves. And I've always used Sherry Turkle, most like you used Manuel Castells. I always like to, because I think it's a generational thing. I think she's just a different generation. But I think I was at this. I just came back from a conference on the Internet of Things, which is again another disruption, another huge change in the way we think about the internet. And one of the women I was speaking to from industry had a compatriot from the university. They were working with dolls that were networked, so that dolls could talk to each other, right? So that they could network with each other and other dolls of other people. And she took the head off of a doll, opened the head, and there was a circuit board in the head of the doll. And I thought, oh, wow, this really will. What would the kid think when this little child opens up the head and sees a circuit board in the head? So I thought, well, maybe Turkle had something point about how it may actually reflect what we think of ourselves, these analogies that people make. But anyway, on to what I'm off to talk about. I want to move away from in my own research generally to try to take stock of the field. And I've done a number of things because of the anniversary of the OII, but also we put together a conference on 10 years in internet time, and we also I also started a handbook on internet studies, so it forced me to really try to reflect on what's going on in the last 10 years. So I really appreciate being invited here, even though I've already spent about all my time on the introduction. But so big problem when you get older. But what I'd like to do is just give you a sense of some of the issues I've come up with trying to put this field together. It was 2000, year 2000, there was a conference in Lawrence, Kansas about internet research. And some people mark that as a real marker in terms of the beginning of the field and so forth, which I don't. But but I think it is clearly we're not in Kansas anymore. I think in the last 10 years, the last 12 years, I suppose, dramatic changes in, I think, maturity of the field, and I'll try to give you a sense of how the field has changed over the last 10 years. First of all, I think in terms of the significance of the internet, I know the last time I said this is significant, I mean, people said, well, of course, Bill, it is, but in 2000, remember, people didn't even think that the internet would last. It was like CB radio or something that it's not going to be significant in the future. And now it is, it's absolutely essential. I think over a third of the people in Britain think it's essential to their everyday work and life. And it's absolutely used more intensively, and it's absolutely viewed as a central aspect of most people's lives. And then people who are not online, about a quarter of Britons, people feel that they're deprived or they're somehow off the digital divide and that they're disadvantaged. So that it's become viewed as not a fad, as not something just a cute innovation, but absolutely something that's amazingly significant. And it's diffused worldwide. So I'll get back to this, but of course, I've written about the new internet world where clearly more people in China are online than in the United States. It used to be completely centered in the U.S. in 2000 and Western Europe, and now Asia and the developing South are far outstripping Western Europe and the North America in terms of being online. So we have the worldwide diffusion and a changing geography of the internet. But also meta research. Winston Ping, for one of another journal issue that we edited for New Media and Society, Winston has done a piece where they did a meta-analysis of referee journals in the social sciences from 2000 to 2010, and looking at the words used in terms of, going through the abstracts of those referee journal articles in the Social Science Citation Index. Internet is the fastest growing term in referee journal articles. The only other term used more frequently than the internet in those articles is environment. But it is growing more rapidly and is more prominent than society, politics, all sorts. I mean, an absolutely burgeoning field in terms of the use of the term internet in referee journal articles in the social sciences. And it's becoming more diverse. So you'll have more research that is more focused on not just the internet, but on social media, on the Internet of Things, on search, and so forth. So you have a more specific diversity of topics around the internet. And I think that the way I would scope the field, I think that it's maturing in the sense that I now see a real structure of the kinds of questions that are dominating. And I know that a lot of people wouldn't accept a Laswellian view of the field, but I think it works increasingly well. If you think of the two questions, what is the object of study? And clearly, nobody defines technology as just equipment, but some people do focus on, for example, the social factors shaping the development of the internet or the Internet of Things, or how social factors are shaping search. So technology is sometimes an object of study. Most often the use of the internet in different, very specific social contexts, but also increasingly policy. And if you look at you can frame internet studies in this respect, and I think it covers most of what we talk about in internet studies in terms of who shapes these technology or use in different contexts and policy. Why? What are the motivations, cultural, structural, otherwise? And so what? What difference does it make? What are the societal implications of the way we design technology, the way we use it in different contexts, and how we shape policy? And I do suppose that there is an underlying assumption of people who do internet research that technology does make a difference and that patterns of use make a difference. I'll deny technological determinism, but I think technology matters. And in fact, there's an assumption that incremental changes in technology actually can sometimes, incremental micro changes in technology can have ripple up to have a major macro societal implications. And that's always a concern, a risk or a hope in terms of technology. So it's not a fad. It's, I think it's, there are multiple perspectives. I think some people, more and more people view it as a multidisciplinary field. It's also increasingly a subfield of a variety of disciplines. Communication clearly has more and more people study new media, and internet studies is within that. In the information field, internet studies is recognized. I think people vary in terms of whether they define the internet narrowly or broadly. I think this is a key issue. Every time when I was editing the handbook and when I look at the literature, there are really people who want to define the internet very specifically. It is the IP protocols that define the internet. It's a very specific thing, invented at a very specific time. Myself and others would define it broadly as a network of networks, and things are becoming increasingly networked, like the Internet of Things is clearly an extension of the internet. And it began much before internet protocols were developed, because people had visions of what we now know as a public information utility or the internet well before that, in the 60s and 70s. So that I would define the internet broadly. And I think this relates to two conceptions of the internet, which I would call, when we think of internet studies, there's one which I think Barry Wellman is the most articulate spokesman for, which is a very particularistic view, which has a fairly narrow definition of the internet as something invented by Vint Cerf and others, and that at the Kansas and Lawrence, Kansas, people came together for the first time and internet studies were born. And Barry often makes the point that it evolved from early work on utopian, dystopian debates, and then it became very descriptive, almost journalistic, descriptive studies, and now it's becoming more mature with theoretically driven work. My argument is, well, it began well before Lawrence, Kansas, and well before the internet was invented in those words, and that it's always been utopian, dystopian. I think I agree with you. You can see this continuity. It's continually, the Internet of Things conference, clearly this is either we're building an Orwellian society with the Internet of Things, or we're going to actually have greater, more efficient future cities, smart cities and so forth, with driven by the Internet of Things. So this utopian, dystopian debate continues. It's also descriptive work continues. It's always, every new media says, well, who's using it? I mean, social media, the rise of the social media always led to, well, how many people are on Facebook? And there's a good descriptive work done at every new phase. And it's always been somewhat theoretically driven, I would argue. There's always theories from political science, sociology, and so forth that have worked their way into assess, for example, the study of community and whether the technology undermines, privatizes, or creates community. All sorts of sociological theories have been thrown at this problem, as well as descriptive research. So I would take a synoptic view, which would take much more general view of internet studies as something that began well before when we first started studying computing and telecommunications and its social impacts, and into since the 50s, when the whole idea of information technology was coined, that it's not just computers, that computers are actually changing information, and this whole coin of information technology, information and communication technology, the internet. And we can get into that if you'd like, but I would urge you to take a broad definition. And I think if you define internet studies broadly, it's really transforming the way we study information and communication technology. I think as the field becomes defined, internet studies itself are sort of consolidating work that has been quite fragmented across the social sciences and computer sciences and elsewhere. It's not resolving that, but in many respects, some of the fields that were formerly quite distant are actually talking to each other more because they realize they're doing internet research, or the internet is a part of it. Even people in computer science and so forth realize, and broadcasting and media studies, see some convergence of technology around internet-based platforms. And it's also, I would argue, not just transforming the way we study information and communication technologies, but transforming the disciplines. So that there's hardly any discipline in the social sciences now that does not recognize internet research as a legitimate aspect that they may actually need to pay attention to. They may not wish to embrace the field as a discipline or anything, but they will increasingly implement or bring in internet studies into their work and see their students legitimately studying the internet. Sociology departments increasingly are graduating more and more students who are very, very focused on social networking and internet studies. They know that that's part of their discipline now. And I'll end really quickly, but just sort of say something about the future of internet studies. I think it has 3 different tracks we could take. Maybe, I think the most probable is that we will try to better network a very multidisciplinary status quo. That right now we have a very multidisciplinary field. It's spread across the various disciplines and with some departments like the OII, but that hopefully we can better network them so that we can not parallel play, but actually understand what each other is doing. There's a sense in which the internet field likes to do this. There was an old article by Leslie Schrum that basically said, he talked about internet undiscipline, or I think was that the name? Said people in the internet field are undisciplined. And this is why I think it's quite nice that Vicki began saying we're going to hear from the top, and then we'll hear from the new students. And well, in the internet field, nobody cares what the old farts have to say. They want to know what the younger students are sort of the authorities in internet studies, and there's sort of this undisciplined lack of any kind of real hierarchical structure in internet studies, and I think that's great. That's part of why I don't think it's going to be a discipline per se. But the sort of negative scenario is I think that there could be increased separation and fragmentation of the field. That, I get proposals for, we want to start a journal of mobile internet. Okay, well, like mobile internet is going to be a new field. And no, it's not a new field. This is part of internet studies, and this is so that this potential risk of increasingly micro-fragment. I'm sure there'll be a journal of Internet of Things. I'm sure there'll be, so that this is going to multiple journals of the Internet of Things. So that's a risk. The potential is also for a more integrative field where it's not impossible that in the future there will be a discipline called, around Internet studies of some word or another. Everyone thinks, well, the disciplines are important, but remember, most of the disciplines we now recognize as disciplines are derivative disciplines. I mean, political science was derived from psychology, political philosophy, sociology, and they came together and formed political science and so forth. Likewise, communication was joined by, it's derivative. It was formed by people in sociology and social psychology and others that started studying television, and they've certainly become increasingly recognized as a discipline. And it's not impossible that people studying the internet and so forth will have more of a derivative discipline in the future. I don't think that's going to happen because of the resistance of institutions from Oxford to any other university, and the field is so populated with fields like information studies, communication studies, so forth. In Oxford, we had a green field. We had no communication department, no information studies department, nothing that really claimed internet studies. It was really, computer scientists said, oh my gosh, no, we're doing mathematics. Now they threaten to do internet research. And I said, fine, come on, let's go. But no one wanted, so we had a green field where we could create a department like this. But in most universities, it is so populated with others who claim parts of the internet and part of internet research. It's going to be much more difficult to create that. But anyway, that's why I say we're not in Lawrence, Kansas anymore. I think the internet has changed dramatically. Gosh, someone made the point at the conference on the Internet of Things that there are only 10 billion people in the world. And if everyone were online, that would be only 10 billion people online. And there are trillions of things that will be networked in the next few years. So that the Internet of Things is wow, this is an order of magnitude in terms of the way in which networks and the internet will be growing, even if beyond people. Okay, thanks very much.
There's 3 points that I thought might be useful to talk about that might be a little bit different to what Judy and what Bill have already mentioned, which was really useful and quite articulate. So the way that I want to connect to that discourse is to first talk about a little bit about the background that I'm occupying with the Urban Informatics Research Lab and how there's this trend around the way that the conferences and the community that we are dealing with has embraced internet studies. So again, the historic perspective is really that human-computer interaction, design, information technology, they really met and they had great conferences even before the internet became commercially viable. And maybe there were a couple of studies that looked at what Vint Cerf and others conceived of in a more experimental setting in terms of the actual potential of TCP/IP, but a lot of that was more about technology and the interfaces between humans and technology. So a lot of that started off with engineers that are interested in this area, with industrial designers that are interested in this area, and a bit of a practice emerged around human factors, the actual messy object in this very nice and tidy equation were the humans, and we had to kind of deal with that problem because without a human it would be really easy to design a car or a elevator or a kitchen, but the fact that humans make the design really messy because we can't predict what they're going to do, we're not really knowing for sure how they're going to behave in that environment, meant that there's this fuzzy element introduced in the design process. And so that gave rise to the way that engineers and the kind of pointy heads, which is my original background, the technologists, try to have a dialogue and embrace this discourse around human factors and human-computer interaction that was interested in understanding the user, in understanding people, and then trying to introduce that knowledge into their design practice, into their development practice, in order to come up with better products. So the very first kind of focus of that was usability. And that trend then expanded because what we witnessed early on was the use of technology in office environments and specifically in professional and work environments. So there's conferences such as CSCW, Computer-Supported Collaborative Work, and that still exists and it's still going really, really strongly. But if you now look at the papers and presentations at those kinds of fora, they don't necessarily focus on just work. Work is still a core part, but it's not uncommon to also see things that happen in a domestic context, as well as things that happen in the third space, as Ray Oldenburg would describe it, outside work and outside home, in fact, in between home and work. So this kind of connects with what Mark Weiser talked about, which is the ubiquity of computing, that we actually are witnessing how computing is not just part of a desktop computer, and the user is moored in a way to this fixed kind of artifact and has to sit on the desk and a chair, and there is this kind of very easy to depict notion or scenario that we find ourselves in. But now we have to imagine that the user could be anywhere. They might be sitting on the toilet, they might be on the bus, they might be on a boat. And so the complexity of the design process increases manifold because of the way that these different scenarios have an impact on the design process. So Mark Weiser's original notion was actually talking about the disappearance of the computer. And in fact, there was a large study in the UK, the Equator project, that talked about the invisible computer. that some might be familiar with because they churned out a lot of publications that were quite remarkable at the time. But that was also criticized eventually because we are not really wanting the computer to disappear to such an extent that we lose control. So eventually that was faced by criticism where people said, no, it's not about the invisible computer, it's about the kind of control that we want to achieve in order to be able to still be, in a way, the masters of the situation. And I think it may or may not have anything to do with the release of the Matrix trilogies that scared people, but popular culture, that's someone else's area, but I would be interested to see their opinion on this. The other kind of way that this is now being propelled is through mobility, specifically mobile devices, but also mobility in the sense of aviation, travel, transport, and so forth, in that we are able to use technology not just at home and at work, but anywhere. But I think, again, there is this challenge for us because Vicki kind of said, well, what are the actual challenges for us in the future? So as you have your smart device, what I kind of see at the moment is really the constraint of this. A lot of people see the opportunities, but I actually see this as a constraint, which is the form factor. So anything that my students come up with ends up being an iPhone app. And I get quite frustrated with that they don't think beyond just the app. It's so convenient to program for it. It's so convenient to use the OS or the Xcode development tools to come up with quick prototypes, to do your experiments, and there's your PhD. But the form factor, the convergence of the form factor, that this is now a torch. There is a microphone. I can measure noise levels if I want to do a citizen science study. I can display my energy monitor kind of data that I showed you earlier this morning. It does everything. It's the Swiss Army knife of research. And I think it would be interesting to actually challenge that and say, well, in addition to the convergence of the form factor, maybe there's an opportunity for us in the future to also look at divergence, to actually say, no, we want a form factor that is specifically designed for this particular purpose. And it doesn't take into account the constraints of what the Apple designers have come up with, which is version 4 right now, and I don't know what version 5 looks like until some poor soul leaves it in a bar. Okay, we get some people are informed about the kind of Apple popular culture. Good. So another thing where I see this first trend heading is the kind of integration of interfaces. So at the moment, we went from desktop to laptop, which is already one big step. Then from laptop is still in use, but then we also have the iPad and smartphones. So that's already a little bit more mobile, and I can put it in my hand. I can use it anywhere. But it's still, in a way, a prosthesis. It's a way that digital information is presented on a small screen. I can use it for navigation, but what we really want is a much better integration between the physical and the digital information that we find. The physical infrastructures that we are quite familiar with, the bodily kind of interactions we have with the environment, as well as the digital information that is now increasingly present to us. I want to know, what are the comments right now in the Twitter back channel? Probably people are saying, oh, he's talking too fast, or maybe that doesn't make any sense. Oh, I really got the joke about the Apple kind of release of the iPhone 4. So all that kind of back channel, that you guys have access to right now, I don't. I'd like these glasses in order for me to wear them and see what's going on right now, in order to really gauge the level of attention of my audience. And when Google released the video, have you guys seen the promo video that they had and the kind of criticism or the kind of commentary it sparked? I think it's interesting to say, well, Google has all the money to do that kind of stuff, and there's all this kind of all these kinds of issues that we as researchers are pointing our finger at. But, do they care? They might actually just, have enough financial power and commercial interest to release this. And they've already taken, I don't know how many thousands of pre-orders for the development tool, the SDK of these glasses. I think one of my colleagues at QUT ordered them already for $1,500 US. You can actually buy some of the SDKs already in order to start developing apps for them. So it doesn't really matter if, there's a couple of social scientists that say, I really don't want this Terminator kind of scenario where, different information is overlaid on top of reality. It might come anyway, and it would be good if we embrace the kind of dialogue in order to inform the way that these engineers somewhere at Google decide on that particular future. So that's the first kind of development around ubiquity. The second one is around Web 2.0, that in a way is a buzzword, but at its core it talks about the participatory nature of the internet, in a way that before we would have HTML, and we would need to be able to, at least to some degree, know a little bit of HTML in order to do anything on the internet, in order to publish, to produce content, to have those GeoCity kind of sites with the animated little GIF logos and stuff. Some might remember those. So the big kind of distinguishing factor there is that now Web 2.0 allows anyone to just participate. And participation might just mean that I'm updating my status on Facebook. I might click like on the Greenpeace page because I really want to save the whales off the coast of Australia, etc., etc. So the participatory nature. And what we witnessed back then was a threat. It was in a way perceived as a risk to those people that were professionally trained in HTML and web development. I recall some of the people that I graduated with from the Bachelor of Multimedia that were paid to produce professional websites, and they said, oh, now there is Blogger and there is WordPress and there's all these content management systems, and it's threatening my existence as a web developer because now people are mucking around in this area that I spent 3 years studying and being trained as a Bachelor of Multimedia or Bachelor of IT. And eventually that kind of ebbed away because people realized, well, the stuff that they're producing might be, nice in a amateur or maybe semi-professional level, but there's still a need, there's still demand for those that have the professional kind of trained craft of creating nicely designed sites. Then a little bit later, a similar kind of struggle occurred when Google released Google Maps, eventually Google Earth, and we had different types of GIS tools that were in the hands of amateurs. And that got geographers upset because they said, we are the people that have been professionally trained in geography. You shouldn't be using these tools and just muck around in our area of expertise. So this trend around neo-geography, where all of a sudden lay people such as you and me are using these navigation tools in order to make sense of the world and make sense of mapping data. And I also think there's this other trend that we're witnessing, which is about the way that the internet enables more and more people to embrace certain activities or practices or a craft that not too long ago were only in the hands of professionally trained people. And now there is a bit of a challenge in the way that those professions look at their existing raison d'etre, their existing identity or rationale for existence. This is also now in a way, a bit of a, not problem, but say a topical focus for librarians. Initially, they would say, internet, I'm not really sure, preservation of knowledge, and what about the actual building of the library as a physical artifact? Do we still need it when Google has digitized all our books? But very quickly, they would embrace this as an opportunity to really focus on new areas of engagement that are enabled by the internet. So it's not all bad. It's probably a little bit of both, but there's definitely a shift occurring. And in my area as well, it's about planning. So urban planners and town planners, they were the ones professionally trained to know about all the kind of statutory requirements of where the buildings are going to be built, what happens to development applications, and we then maybe sometimes also engage citizens in consultation sessions. These days, we embrace the internet in order to enable lots of people to participate and have a say and have a voice and be heard, and sometimes that can be uncomfortable. And so there is this notion of the planning that occurs without the planners. And again, it threatens the existing profession that are now struggling to make sense of what are we doing about this. We can't really ignore it. We can't really go back to the old days and wind back the clock. So in a way, what we need to be able to do is move forward and use this as an opportunity to see what how can the profession of urban planning or town planning take advantage of this particular trend. And just lastly, to finish off, the most interesting one I feel is this trend from bits back to atoms. So rather than just looking at the digitization that the internet enables, there's now, I think, an emerging trend, and maybe it's just like a weak signal, as future studies people call it, that talks about the way that we can take digital information back into a physical kind of format. So this one here is the Burke printer that was developed by the Burke Design Studios in London, but there's also a Internet of Things 2D kind of printer that is very similar. It doesn't look quite as nice, but it's very hackable, and we got one of them in our labs. So you can program and customize this little printout. It's really just like a credit card statement that you get at the point of sale kind of thing when you swipe your credit card. It's the same format, the same mechanism in terms of the technology. But here you're able to, for instance, put out the Foursquare recommendations. There's little images that the Berkeley Labs put up about, for instance, a to-do list that you can put into your pocket. So it's about the kind of materiality, the fabrication of these artifacts that is coming back, but it's also done by just anyone. It's not requiring the installation of any kind of professional tools. It enables you to appropriate that kind of mechanism here. And I think the most advanced step in this particular trend of digital fabrication is the MakerBot. This one here was presented at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. And if we look at the way that laser printers developed in terms of, when I remember first laser printers coming about, they were only really affordable by institutions like universities or libraries, and large photocopiers would cost thousands of dollars. Eventually the price comes down, so now I think you can buy a laser printer for only a couple of $100. So this is a 3D printer that prints up objects made of plastic, and it's only $1,000. I think there were some prices around $700 or $800. So imagine that you actually have a 3D printer at home that not too long ago was only really affordable to architectural bureaus or design schools that would spend tens of thousands of dollars in order to install and maintain this equipment. So if your child's toy is broken, you print out the spare part. If your car needs a spare part, you might also just download it from the internet, and it comes out and you can put it in there. So the impact that might have on retail, on the way that business is conducted. If my sunglasses don't suit me anymore, I might just print out a new model in a new color that just suits the kind of appearance I want to have at this particular time and day. So I think the digital fabrication, the trend to go from bits back to atoms, is the third one that I find is quite interesting. And I don't have all the answers of what that actually means in the future, but those are the three that I wanted to point out to maybe pose as further items for the discussion that we have later today. And there is a fourth trend that I found as well, but that will be discussed tomorrow in the paper that I got with Laura Folano and Mark Balanzik, another two alumni. And that's the trend from the office cubicle to hot desks to not having an office at all and using the city as your office. So thank you very much.